9:47.
9:47.
9:47.
It's good to be back with y'all tonight. I missed all of you this morning. I woke up and my head was pounding. I didn't want any lights on in the house whatsoever, but it must have just been sinuses. It all drained after I got up, I guess. But it's good to be here with you tonight. Tonight, we're going to be returning to our theme of this series called Overflow, and the base text of this series comes from John chapter 7, verses 37 and 38. It says, "Now on the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, 'If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. The one who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water.'" We're seeing Jesus as the one who truly satisfies. If anyone thirst, come to Jesus and drink, and you will find life-satisfying waters. But not only will we find satisfaction, we're to have these streams of living water flowing out of our hearts and into the world. People are to come to us and find the life-giving waters of Jesus flowing from us. So, we've asked ourselves the question in the first lesson, what flows out of us? What do people see flowing from us? And in our second lesson, we talked about overflowing in worship and prayer, and we compared Simon the Pharisee and the notoriously sinful woman that we see in Luke chapter 7. And in our lesson tonight, we're going to look at how we are to overflow in mercy and grace. If you would, grab a Bible, go to Matthew chapter 7. I want us to look at this passage that we may not really think about it being about mercy and grace, but I want us to consider Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, and let's look at what Jesus is teaching. Verses 1 and 2, we read, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the very way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you." Most people know this first verse really well, and they want to make a big deal out of this verse. Don't judge so that you will not be judged. But if we don't keep reading, we're going to completely miss the point that Jesus is making. Jesus is not getting rid of all judgments. God gave us the scripture so that we could judge our own hearts and judge our own lives. Stopping all of the judgments is not the point that Jesus is making here. The point is for us to look at how we are judging others. Look at verse 2. Jesus says that how you judge others is how God is going to judge you. Jesus says that how you measure other people, that's how God is going to measure you. Let's think about that for a minute. How you choose to look at other people is the way that God is going to choose to look at you. Now, we might think that could be a good thing, right? Maybe we think that we're doing a good job in the way that we are looking at other people. So Jesus, he continues on. He makes sure that we're not thinking about ourselves in that way. In verses 3 and 4, we read, "Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and look, the log is in your own eye?" What does Jesus say is the problem with how we look at other people? The problem is that we find it so easy to nitpick all of the issues that we see in another person, but we can't see our own issues and faults. We have no problem finding all of the problems in another person's life, but we refuse to see all of the problems in our own lives. Ironically, sometimes the problems we see in other people are the very same problems that we have in our own lives. But we can only see the other person's faults and not our own. This is especially true when, we have a Bible study or a sermon, and we hope that some other person heard that lesson. We hope our spouse heard the lesson. We hope our parents or our children. Addie, Easton, y'all listening? We hope our children heard that lesson. It's so easy to pick apart the lives of others. And Jesus, he even uses a contrast as he speaks here about this. He says, you're pulling specks out of other people's eyes when you have a log extending from your own. You know, sometimes it gets to the point in our relationships that we want to find the specks. We're just lying in wait, looking for something else that we can judge, that we can nitpick about that person. And this is something that's really become bad today in our culture. You know, we're always looking for every little speck in the lives of other people. Basically, we find specks in the fact that someone doesn't agree with us. You know, we think it's a mountain of a problem that this person doesn't want to watch what we watch, vote how we vote, think how we think, and act how we act. Maybe they don't look like we look. There are so many just surface level judgments that we make about people. And unfortunately, as Christians, we can easily allow this toxic cultural thinking to change the way that we think, and we start doing the very same thing. We start being critical and judging by these kind of externals rather than looking at other people the way that God looks at them. We need to see that we are looking, that what we are looking at may not be a speck at all. Maybe the log in our eye is completely distorting how we're looking at the other person. Now, you may be wondering what this has to do with the topic that I said this lesson is about. You know, this area is one big reason why we fail to overflow with mercy and grace. We overflow with criticism and judgment rather than mercy and grace because we're looking for specks in other people's lives. You know, when we deem ourselves the fault finder of other people's lives, it will be absolutely impossible to show mercy and grace to others. Rather than making allowances for people, we found a speck, and we're going to make sure that everyone knows that this person has that speck. Let me ask you a question, church. Do you want to be judged that way? Do you want to be treated that way? Then why do we do this in our relationships? Why do we do this with others if that's not how we want to be treated? So what does Jesus want? He goes on in verse 5. He says, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Jesus wants you to look at yourself before you look at others. If we're going to overflow with mercy and grace, then when we see a speck in a person's eye, the first thing we need to think about are all the specks that we have in our own eyes. We need to ask ourselves why that person's speck is bothering us so much. Why are we so consumed with the choices that others are making? I think one of the reasons why we like to find specks in other people's eyes is because it makes us feel better. It's a method of deflection. I'll take the attention off of my life and spotlight the failures of others around me. Look at that dumb person. Buddy, I didn't point at you, I promise. Look at that dumb person. That person's so dumb for what they did. It sure does make me look better. This is the way that we defend the specks and logs in our eyes too. I might have a problem, but look at all of your problems. We're really good at that too. Rather than extending mercy, we extend judgment. Rather than extending grace, we extend criticism. So we stare at other people's specks, acting like we don't have any specks in our eyes or even logs in our eyes. Before you start talking about how everyone else is such a failure, you need to remind yourself that you are just as much a failure. And church, this may sound like backwards, upside down thinking, but there's something kind of liberating about living your life that way. If someone has a criticism or a complaint against you, just own it. You know what? You're right. I am a sinner. And notice what Jesus called people who don't do this. He calls them hypocrites. If you don't think that you have your own specks and logs, then Jesus says, you are a hypocrite. And we can liberate ourselves from this way of thinking by just admitting that we are awful sinners. We're judgmental. We're failures. We've fallen short of the glory of God. We've been caught up in things that we should not have said or done. I want us to look at what the writer in Ecclesiastes teaches in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 21 and 22. It says, "Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others." Notice the model that the writer of Ecclesiastes gives us here. The reason you can let go of what others have said about you is because you know that you've done the exact same thing. You know that you've done it too. You know that you need just as much mercy and grace as the next person. So now come back to Matthew chapter 7 and verse 5. After you have the log out of your eye, is Jesus saying that now you can judge? Now you can judge others now that you've got this log out of your eye? Since I don't have the problem that this person is showing, I have the right to criticize and judge them? No, that's not what Jesus is saying at all. We need to tie verse 5 back into the first two verses of chapter 7. The big log in our eye is the way that we look at people and evaluate their lives. Jesus wants us to look at people the way that he does. Use God's point of view, not your own point of view. Would this not fix a whole lot of the world's problems today? When we look at ourselves first, then we won't be so quick to judge by our judgments and unrighteousness, thinking we need to be thinking with God's way of thinking. And then maybe we can actually help someone. Then we will be able to overflow with mercy and grace toward people. Listen to what Jesus said earlier in this very sermon. Back in chapter 5 and verse 7, we read, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." If we want God to be merciful toward us, then we must show mercy to others. We can't be what Jesus has called us to be as merciful people until we see the log in our own eyes and focus our attention on removing it first. Now, I want us to take a second here and be honest with ourselves. How hard is that? How hard is it to remove the logs and specks from your eye? It's really hard, isn't it? Think about all of the sins and failures that you've committed over and over again. Think about all the things that you've done that you're sorry for, that you've repented of, that you've asked forgiveness for, and then committed again. Think about how difficult that is. Now, keep this in mind when we're seeing others with their specks and logs. Look at people the way that God sees them, not through, the self-righteous lens that we so often look at people through. We can't be gracious until we work on the logs and specks in our own eyes first. And the more aware we are of how much more work God must do in our lives, the more gracious and merciful we're going to be to others that we run into, people that we see, because we know that God has just as much work to do in their lives as He does our own. I mean, going back to Jesus' time, think about the Pharisees that Jesus, he was interacting with on a daily basis. Why were they the way that they were? They had logs in their eyes. They didn't see what led them to be harsh. The log in their eyes led them to be merciless. It led them to be ungracious people. They didn't care about people. They cared about themselves and judged. They judged Jesus harshly. So, what are we full of? What is overflowing out of us? Do we overflow in worship and prayer, like we talked about 2 weeks ago? Does mercy and grace overflow out of us? Or is it criticism? Is it judgment? Anger? Is that what overflows from us? What log is in your life that is keeping you from seeing others clearly? How can we complain about other specks when we have logs and specks too? I know Chase's sermon was kind of long this morning, so I'm going to cut y'all loose early tonight. As we close out tonight, remember that God's grace overflows into our lives so that we can share it with others. If you need His mercy tonight, His arms are open. If you want His grace, He's ready to strengthen you. Whatever need you may have, we're here for you. Please come forward as we stand and as we sing.